All right, good
Great.
to go.
Can everyone see the agenda that I've shared?
Yep.
Okay, great. This will be a quick meeting, folks. I'll give you back some time for your day, but really appreciate everyone taking time to meet. This will be the third meeting of the Removal and Disposal Subcommittee. All of the other subcommittees have met at least 3 times, and we've had 2 overall work group meetings. So we really like the pace of this. We're getting a lot of work done. We did have a little curveball thrown at us that Meghan Kies with DEQ, who was previously with the Coast Guard and is now on the reserves. She's been called up to active duty to somewhere in Maryland to administer some COVID vaccination shots. So she will be out until June of this year. So we're just this was meant as sort of a update on everyone and to see where things were in some of the previous tasks we discussed and just get overall updates from the group. But first I wanted to share ever so briefly with everyone a summary of some of the interviews we've had with some other states. I'm going to stop sharing the agenda and peel on over to the other state interviews. Let me share it again. So this was going back to way before I started working with Katie back in August of 2020 up until a couple of weeks ago. We had interviewed or at least had some dialogue with California, Oregon, South Carolina, Florida, and Rhode Island as well, and then finally Ohio, in addition to the guest speaker, Major Meyer of North Carolina. So we've had a nice solid group of states. There wasn't really a scientific sampling method behind this, but we wanted to get neighboring states. And as we just mentioned, kind of before the call started, we've been introduced to some folks from Maryland and also Washington State. So we're really looking to get similar states in terms of geography, waterways, neighboring states, and then states that have pretty much a big ADV problem and they have an advanced program to address it. So Florida would be kind of one of those latter categories. So what I did with the funding subcommittee yesterday was go highlight more of the the funding aspects of this, and we can get into a little bit of that more because there is that cross-pollination between removal and funding. I know Terry was on that call, but I think he joined a little bit late, so this was at the beginning, so I think it'll be helpful to everyone here. Really just looking at the things I want you all to keep in the back of your head are the mechanism of how, from a policy standpoint, again, this was shared with the policy subcommittee as well last Friday, but to think about, should this be a state-run program? Should this be, something that you push down to localities and their public works department, local law enforcement? What's the capacity of each of those individuals or those entities? And then, how is maybe a economy of scale, a cost sharing thing when we think about prioritizing the vessels to be removed? So all this is within kind of the jurisdiction of multiple subcommittees. So I'll do my best to give you an overview on these methods, these frameworks from other states, and then Katie can kind of get into some things that we've proposed funding wise and double check some of the costs data that we've got so far. So one of these things is comes up a lot is the voluntary turn-in program. Katie's mentioned this quite a bit. We want to kind of highlight that California has a successful one that they've developed to kind of get that economy of scale. So at-risk vessels, to encourage the owners to turn them in, and therefore it's easier to get a bunch of these together, go around and remove them, trailer them, versus after the fact when they're sunk. And I know Gary and Terry know, the cost and the difficulties of removing a vessel that's sunk. So it's, we want to prioritize something that's a public safety hazard in the middle of the channel. Someone could strike it at night, it's leaking fuel, whatever. But after that first kind of cut of really urgent removal needs, then we kind of go down and we say, well, maybe it's listing in its slip in the marina, it's not going to go anywhere. Maybe we've got to go get a bunch that are all at the same marina of varying degrees of seaworthiness versus, oh, well, this one over here and this one over here. So lots to think about in the logistics. But that was a success story from California. I won't really get into the fees. That was sort of a funding thing. We did want to note that these states are looking at mostly recreational, whether it's in the statute or the fee that is designated for removal. There are for recreational boaters that are paying this fee, and that is going to go into a fund that removes recreational vessels. And there's been a couple times that, unless it was emergency funding, I believe in Florida, some of these vessels that have been displaced during a storm or hurricane, that it was strictly limited to recreational. So that's another thing to think about, and the logistics of both those type of craft. Oregon was, some of you may have attended the overall work group meeting where Dorothy Deal of Oregon gave an overview of sort of their range of prices for how these things go. But really, the state is the one that identifies, prioritizes these projects, and they just go after them. And then they hire a contractor because they have a little bit of money, $150K a year, but with that money, they make it go as far as it can. And they have a list of pre-vetted certified contractors, and they go out and they just remove them. So there's not much partnership other than with a clean marina program. They work with local law enforcement, but it's more of a top-down state approach. Going into South Carolina or Florida, this note here is not really much for us to concern ourselves with, other than that soft money from NOAA. Some of these states, like my program, the Coastal Zone Management Program, can apply for a 5-year cycle of policy funding. The carrot is it's match free. The stick is you have to have an enforceable policy at the end of it. So some of that's just sort of background, not as much related to this. Florida is very interesting. They kind of call it the law and order, that they are really going to pursue folks. Titling is something that I think Gary's brought up in past meetings. Tracking down that ownership, they really put the burden on the seller, to transfer and make sure the buyer has followed up with their due diligence and re-registering and titling the vessel, so that when you're the last known buyer and the buck stops with you, and all sorts of civil and criminal penalties could be enforced. So they can put a lien on your driver's license. So they really go after it that way, more of a deterrent. And then they do have that funding to clean up some of these things. But this kind of gets the first method of local cooperation, where they will work with localities who will first come, first serve. The state's got a pot of money. The localities will say, hey, these are the ones we want to remove. And they will then apply for basically a grant. So the locality has to front the cost, and then they will get reimbursed via this grant, which provides for just the cost of the removal, no admin or overhead or labor time for the locality. So that's worked pretty well for them. There is something to note that back to the economy of scale, you can do sort of a bulk removal, as I've highlighted here, versus a rapid emergency thing. So really just cut some of the red tape for the emergency, but also if it's not a threat to public safety, they can gather a couple of vessels together and make it more efficient that way. So really, and at risk, that's another thing, kind of going back, it's not as much of a voluntary, just bring us your vessel. It's more local law enforcement working with folks and kind of tracking them down and saying, hey, sir, ma'am, this boat looks like it's pretty bad shape. What do you want to do? Do you want to go forward and work with to get some funding to remove it, or to mitigate that hazard before it becomes a real ADV? So that's kind of Florida. One thing that did come up in, I believe, this subcommittee meeting was sort of appraising the vessel and whether it's junk and how you can go, and whether it's the government with all their liability backing, whatever for the actual removal, damaging another vessel, that sort of thing. That's a separate issue from a takings of private property. And there are some civil rights issues that came into that as well in Florida. And we learned that it was not a court case. There's a little bit of playing telephone where the information got a little bit jumbled, but they confirmed that they really had been threatened that, someone would, bring some sort of action, but none was actually brought, because people were living on these boats that, were declared junk from the state's perspective, but they were starting to do the paperwork to work on removal. And these folks said, well, I'm living on this boat. So that's another thought in the removal process, how to sidestep that. So that's Florida. Rhode Island is another state where it is a kind of empowered to the localities, where the state is the one funding it, and they get removal fees, or fees from registration for removal, but they have a commission. So that's another idea that maybe not touches more on the policy and the funding subcommittees, but they have a commission made up of NGOs, state agency planning staff, state law enforcement, harbor masters, folks in industry, businesses, and they vote on applications submitted by a locality for a vessel that's on public lands or public bottom or public waterway. So a little limited jurisdiction, but that is sort of, again, power to the localities. The state will work with them to get an application together. This is something we might want to talk about later in this meeting about, what should the application look like? If we are indeed having anyone, a tower, local law enforcement, local public works, that sort of thing. And then really, they are kind of, they're fine in terms of their backlog, that it's manageable, but we also want to think about, this came up in previous subcommittee meetings about a contingency fund. If we get a surplus after a couple of years, how do we make sure that that's, that the stewardship of that resource is transparent, it's fair, doesn't go back to the General Assembly general fund, it doesn't get spent on a bunch of decals and bumper stickers for more outreach than you need. I mean, how do we manage these monies long term, and what should that governing body look like? And then Ohio, I'll really breeze through this because they are the most hands-off that we've seen of the interviews, where they're really saying, we'll work to track down the last known owner, and then they will work to get the title put over to anybody, a tower. Most of them are salvage folks, but any sort of, or a private marina owner, and they just remove it. So they don't have as much data on the costs and logistics of removing vessels, because it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. So that's really, excuse me, South Carolina. This one is very interesting. This is probably the most interesting. Is basically they work with their localities, public works, but the state can also go ahead and throw rope on a vessel and tow it away. And what they have to do is the same or similar due diligence processes as the other states and Virginia would have to do. But once they do they put a placard on the vessel and they send them a certified letter and that sort of thing. Once they've done their due diligence, it's game on, and they can go immediately sign over, go to the last known owner. So even if that's not the current owner, the last registered owner, they'll say, would you like to sign this piece of junk over? It'll save you the property tax on it. And the person usually says yes. And then the state or the locality public works department just throws a rope on it, or hires a contractor to do it, who is also certified, has insurance, and they just tow it away. And they don't mess around. So it's interesting that they have the willingness, they have at least the legal counsel and the capacity and the coverage from being the state doing their job, preserving the public health, removing a threat to the public safety, and they basically said, try to sue us, good luck. So that is a very interesting a contrast to Virginia, in which we're a little uncertain about the jurisdiction, and then even with funding, how the jurisdiction would be implemented by DWR and BMRC. So that's hopefully wasn't too long-winded. That tried to hit the high points of removal versus some of the other things we talked about here. But I can pause there for any questions.
So since this is the removal and disposal subcommittee, I think one of the interesting things that we heard from several states is their program, which depends on working with local governments. A number of states had reimbursement protocols in place where a local municipality could be in contact with the state agency and say, we've got an ADV, we've tried to find the owner, we need to remove it, our estimate is $4,000 or whatever. The state would approve that. Then the local government would remove and dispose of the vessel and send the bill, or get reimbursed. And a number of states had two processes, one that was slower for non-emergencies and then one that was expedited. So I think that would be an interesting thing for us to talk about today. Does this subcommittee endorse attempting such a thing? And Jeff and I, actually it was Jeff's idea, I think it's one that should be explored, about block grants to PDCs. PDCs are planning district commissions, which are geographically more than just one county. And sorry, that's my little dog, if you can hear her. And so it might be possible to work with a PDC that has 6 or 7 ADVs and get, as Jeff mentioned, economies of scale. So I think that would be a good starting discussion point for today. What do you all think about that model for disposal and removal? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, Terry.
I don't know that I have an answer to that right now. I don't mind the localities. You know, I don't think there's a problem with including the localities into it. I don't have an answer right now. I guess I want to hear some more about it and understand how they interact and what limitations they would have and when the state would come in and so on and so forth. But otherwise, to me, it would all fall on the state to manage it like a Florida would, as opposed to, is it Ohio that has the localities?
It is South Carolina and Rhode Island. Well, Florida is the state and then reimburses localities. Rhode Island is the state, reimburses localities. South Carolina is the state that works with localities, but they really absorb the costs and the state can also remove them. Ohio is the one that really just tracks down people, but then doesn't really do anything. They do have to send a certified letter approving that that person can get the title and kind of transfer it, but the actual removal, there's not really much of a cost reimbursement. And then what was the other one? Oregon is strictly state. They go after them. I think California is similar.
Kind of inclined to. I mean, I know the Florida model fairly well.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that they're aggressive law enforcement on it, and that's that I like that approach because there's more teeth in it, and people would respect it a little bit more. If it's sort of a, hey, just let us have it, we'll get rid of it for you. That just doesn't sing well with me. It just makes me. In Virginia, it's probably a little better than it may be in some of these other states, but in Florida, they couldn't get away with that because everybody would unload it on them, and it's just too much. So you can see the scale.
Mm-hmm.
Florida deals with a huge scale, the largest scale of any of the states, I guarantee you. Carolinas might be in there, but Florida's huge because they've got people living on these boats and they just trash them and let go of them. And then they move on to the next junk boat that they get in and do it. So that it's a homeless population situation as well as a derelict vessel population situation. So they have to be a lot more aggressive. I would like to look at that a little bit. I would like to put that on our list of, if we were to pick 2, that would be definitely my number 1. The second would probably be Carolinas.
Yep.
In your opinion, Terry and Gary and everyone else on the call, how much is the derelict vessel problem in Virginia related to the homeless, squatters on the boats? I've heard that from mostly the southern states where people could live on a boat year round, but is it a problem up here?
It's a weather thing. I don't think it's as big a problem up here by far as Florida. All you have to do is go to any key in the Key West area in the Florida Keys, and you can see there's 50 people living on a boat at any given bay or every given cove you can see. So there's thousands and thousands of people down there living on boats. Here, it's really not. Most of the jurisdictions do not even allow you really to live on board a vessel in a marina. It's restrictive. There's only a certain number allowed, and that's most marinas don't want it. So that's one. And then you're just anchoring out and rowing back and forth. You're going to have a few. I bet in the state of Virginia, if we had 50 like that, I would be surprised. And they're going to all be down in the Tidewater area. Going to be in, kind of close to the warmer air, the warmer waters, and some kind of a population where they can get things without being disturbed, kind of out of the way. But up in this direction, no, nobody's going to put up with it. A piece of property that's worth $1 million with no house on it, that's a quarter acre, they're not going to let anybody get near that piece of property and hang out. So.
Great. We'll make sure we capture that in the notes. Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I think our problem is not going to be the homeless or boat home type people. It's going to be more just, hey, I don't want this piece of junk anymore. And it's crazy to see what I'm seeing in the boat repair business. I'm getting phone calls and people are showing up in the marina as well. I'm getting boats that are 1980s and 1970s that they're bringing back out of wherever they found this thing, and they're trying to make it run. A lot of them they're running. I mean, these are running, functioning boats that aren't running well. They need to get fixed, and they're looking for a slip for it, or they're looking for repairs on it. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that. That boat would have been in the backyard under a tree rotting, and now it's been brought back out. So those are the boats we're going to see coming. The next wave, I would predict, is the 25 or older year boats, older than 25 years old. Average boat is 25 years. Average used boat is 25 years old right now in the country. So these boats are 30 and 40 years old, and they're going to be used up for the last time. And then where can I get rid of this thing is the next phase of it. I see that coming in the next 5 years. We'll have a larger flux of that. Whether they'll dump them in the rivers and dump them off into the lakes, I don't know, but they're going to find them on the side of the road. You're going to find them everywhere.
And this is because of the temporary increased demand for boats because of COVID, would you say?
That's what I would say. Yeah.
All right.
And Katie, I can answer that question. We just handled one for the Department of Wildlife. It's a 18-foot sea ray that they intentionally scuttled on a Department of Game and Inland Fisheries lake here in Stafford. And it definitely needed to be done away with, but people just buy these older boats. Like Terry says, the boats are no good, but the engines are good, or the boats are good and the engines are no good. And they'll take what they can and cannibalize it. And it's so hard to get rid of a hull. It's so expensive to get rid of a hull up here. Just like this, when they dumped the boat and the trailer in the lake. And I actually still have that sitting on my storage facility trying to locate the last titled owner.
All right. Well, it seems like a well-timed discussion then with this flux coming. Are there any other things that Jeff shared from what we heard with other states that you think we should explore more in Virginia as far as removal and disposal?
No, I think it's pretty broad strokes on that. You're getting into the most of that was to do with the process, the initial process of how to manage it on the front side. I think maybe our focus here is more focused on how to do the actual removal and the cost of that, and then the disposal end of it. So the other two pieces, there's three pieces of this effectively. The funding and the regulations and so forth are on the front end. We have those committees. I think, isn't this one more focused? We should be drilling down a little bit more into the cost, the standards for contractors, how do you vet the contractors? How do we put the list together? Where do they go? What are resources for the disposal that can help these contractors do it? Things like that, two ends of the chain.
That's a great point, Terry. I think the reason why we were trying to at least kind of get everyone on the same page with the update was we wanted to see from your end and that side of it, if the state, if you're on a list of a pre-certified tower, and would you feel more comfortable working with DWR? Say they are, let's assume that would be the flagship ADV agency. Did they come and work with their law enforcement folks and they open up a case like they do in Florida, and they're doing all their homework on the last known owner, and then it really comes down to them giving you a contract to remove the vessel? Or would you feel more comfortable working closely with local governments and reporting some of these vessels, and then kind of you get sort of a package together, a wish list, a bulk, list of vessels, and then you work with that locality to submit a grant application to the state, and then the locality gets the money, and then you get a contract with them? Like, what is better for you? What approach? So that's kind of what we were trying to.
Okay. So as you just laid that out, the last one doesn't appeal to me at all. When you start saying, the inventory, figure out what it is. It's a long drawn out process to me. It's if the localities are not interested in getting involved, or they have let's put this low on their priority list, it goes nowhere. because I'm not going to push it. It's not enough business for me to say it's a great big business opportunity for me to go out and find all that. Now in Florida, there's plenty of it, and it might make it worthwhile because it fills in the gaps. But I'm not out looking for junk boats to get rid of. It doesn't. It's a sideline for me, not a mainstream. My mainstream, I'm making $300-400 an hour towing a boat in. So it's big discrepancy. So disparity. But I would say that I would be more comfortable. I know Gary's got a great relationship with the localities. So for him, it might be, he's probably going to go that way. I would think mine, I'd rather deal with a single agency, a state. Tell me you want it to go, I'll go get it and I'll take care of it. I'm on your list.
Terry, I'm in the same boat with you. When you put the government, a local government involved in anything, it goes to the bottom of their pile. And that's pretty much the end. Virginia DWR, I have absolutely no problem in working with them under any circumstances. They tell me they're still trying to find the last known owner of this vessel so I can collect payment for salvaging it out of the Gate Department's lake. But they're more in touch with what a government would say, well, that's not a priority to us. A county agency would say, well, that's not a priority to us. The DWRs will say, well, it's in the middle of the channel going to Aquia Harbor. I think it should be. So I would rather work with the local game wardens and law enforcement, to be honest with you.
So I will add, Terry and Gary covered a lot of it, but for us on a national level dealing with the towers, and Terry and Gary are my favorite, is the struggle is working with the local municipalities because they don't. An example in Virginia is Chincoteague. Our tower there right now has been pushing them to remove a derelict vessel and they're not moving on it. And he's about to go and remove it at cost to just have it gone before it becomes a bigger problem. And that who to contact and who to work with and the individual person in that municipality is a struggle when it comes to even the federal grants with NOAA for funding that we've done. Is who do we talk to work this out? And if me personally, if I could go directly to the state and only deal with the state when we're doing this, the NOAA national grants, that would be a lot easier than trying to go to the individual ones and try to make it a priority for them when they already have more than enough priorities that are not on this horizon.
Great input.
Great. This is gold. This is excellent. This is exactly what I was looking for, to get that frank feedback, because that dictates kind of which way we're going this. If I see Jess Sorrell is on the line as well, I don't know if you want to talk to the Coast Guard's perspective. I would assume that the less branch or levels of government you go through, the better in terms of federal to state from that opposite direction. But I also don't know. I don't know if local law enforcement and have worked with the Coast Guard better in the past. I don't know if Jess is with us here.
Good morning. So it kind of becomes a situation where, and I also have another Coast Guard member here with me as well, Alex Leatherman. He's been sitting in with me. Basically, from a removal standpoint, we tend to get a little bit more, I guess, because we have like that federal pool. We get a little bit more leeway, but from our standpoint, we're looking at it as how can we better service this program, this plan, and the civilian side.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So as far as the removal process goes, from our particular office standpoint, where we're involved in a lot of removal of hazardous materials and oil discharges or potentials, we're not as concerned about the actual holes coming out unless they're actually becoming a hazard of navigation. So as far as this process goes, what we do need is we need to kind of get an idea of what is happening so that we can enact whatever needs to be enacted, whoever we need to call during the process to help you guys out. Because a lot of times we're on scene, we get asked the question, who's taking this boat out of the water? Well, it's not necessarily going to be us. So we would actually want to know who to notify at that point, so that we can get whatever ball rolling to get that cleaned up for you guys.
And the
Excellent. Thank you.
contractors get paid regardless.
Hey, Jeff, so to tie on to then explain a little bit more, they can tell us as well, but the Coast Guard has, like I said before, when they raise a vessel, they'll raise it, they'll pump the hazardous materials off of it, and then they'll set it back down again. That's where the coordination with the state to take it from there, never put it back down, share this opportunity and move it on would be great, just kind of difficult to do. They do in that process. Jess, can you guys tell them a little bit about the BOA, because they have what's called a basic operating agreement. I think is what it's called. It's the BOA is the vetting of the contractor effectively for these large federal projects. And I don't have one. I've never applied for one, but I've promoted it forever. But that's another, we can take some of the information from the BOA process and possibly use it for our vetting of our contractors as well.
Yep.
So good morning. I'm not actually as well versed in the BOA contracting. That's another office, but I can look into it. But basically, like you said with the BOA, we have these contracted salvage persons, and so they work within the range because we're going to be using that the removal fund, and we work within the range. Of course, they put out their quote. They put out how much. Again, we're looking more for pollution removal, and sometimes that does include the salvage. So the raising the boat, the pulling it out of the water, to maybe taking it out of the waterway so it's not impeding vessel traffic. But what I can do is I can jot down that and just go ahead and talk to the, do you remember her name? The woman that does our BOA contracts for this area? Because every district is going to be different.
No, we would actually need to look up the representatives on that. So the thing is, BOA, it's a great concept. We've got, a lot of companies contracted for removal, cleanup, divers, all sorts of different stuff that at our disposal, but that's typically used through a federal project. So when we're talking BOA, it's usually when we're heading towards that federalization of a cleanup. So at that point, we're not talking much in the way of like a state level or a locale. It usually is because there's either nobody there to clean it up because it's a derelict vessel, or it's because there's a responsible party that has been unable to do what we need them to do.
Yeah, but I think he's more looking for information of how to become one of those Coast Guard BOA contractors.
Okay, so you're asking how to actually get on that list. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
If we use, we could use some pieces of that effectively. I've put together, and I sorry, Katie, I was going to send it to you, and I didn't, and I can't really get in here to play with it right now. So I'll send it right after this call. But putting together some standards or some qualifications for a contractor, and the BOA does that. The BOA, it's going to it asks for insurance, qualified insurance, your certificates for the various things you have to do. A lot of these companies realize that they're what we're talking about, guys, is a typical BOA contractor is going to be somebody with a very large barge, crane, divers, commercial divers, pollution response people, a larger corporation, generally not a smaller corporation. Now, a lot of our towers do have BOAs. We can comply with it. Everybody has different levels and different reaches for it, but I wouldn't typically go after a contract for something that was a 150-foot freighter or tug that sank in the bay. I wouldn't go for that contract. It's out of my scope. Now I could take it and I could sub it as long as it complies, but you're talking about a 50-footer or a 60-footer or whatever, doing various things. We've got guys in North Carolina that have BOAs that pull 100-foot freighter or 100-foot trawlers off the beach and do the entire salvage piece. And they do it under both, under the supervision of the Coast Guard as well as under the supervision of the states and everything else. But the BOA may just give us a few items or some parameters for the qualifications and an application to apply to be one of our contractors, so to speak.
Okay. All right. So I understand what you're saying now, sir. If this is something that, some information that you want to know, what I would suggest is to actually just form it in an email and send it over to us with the exact questions that you want answers to. And what we can do is kick it around and see if we can actually get some answers for that to present at the next subcommittee meeting for you, or to shoot back to you.
Yeah, we can even go online and probably at Homeport, there's probably the forms for application for a BOA, and that would be all I really need to move with this. So I'll look into that myself.
Okay, Roger.
It's just, it's a
I
foundation.
have a question. I don't know anything about how you become a certified tower with Boat US, but is that a certain level of certification that would be acceptable? I mean, at what point does Virginia have to create a new program, or how much could we rely on whatever certification you already have through Boat US towing?
So yeah, there's a couple of things. Whether to be in the Boat US program, one, you have to have proper insurances. You have to have all your personnel that are operating boats have to be licensed. The vessels have to be inspected. We go through a pretty robust process of verifying who we are, what we are, and that we can comply and we're legitimate. The other group that's involved in this is called Seaport, C-P-O-R-T. It's the National Association for all of the towing and salvage companies in the country. Basically, it doesn't have color lines or company lines. It's members. I was chairman of that for 2 eternities, it seems like. But anyway, it's a good vehicle to go through, because not only does Boat US require that we comply with various standards and insurance, the captains, the inspections of the vessels, the equipment we have on board each vessel, and how we go about it. Primarily for towing, not so much really for salvage, but that's the other piece of our business. So it's a natural dovetail. Seaport has the same and possibly, and actually a higher certification is called ACAP certification, ACAPT. And that's to qualify for that, we have to prove everything that we have to Boat US. And then we are under a routine inspection of our vessels on a random inspection process. So we have to have the equipment up to date, everything up to speed, and all our paperwork right. So we could say very easily that a contractor would have to be an ACAP, Seaport ACAP qualified provider. And that would automatically hit most of the standards we're talking about here.
Gotcha.
That's usually what we include about the towers doing salvage work for the NOAA grants, as well as like some of their documentation for like safety protocols and OSHA and all of that, which Seaport handles in being part of that. So that's usually what we provide.
So would you suggest that Virginia use those existing certifications as a baseline, as opposed to creating its own certification?
For sure. That's the vehicle that ensures that somebody else, a third party, is looking at that operation at that company. So right off the bat, we can mirror the, we'll put together, I would think we would have a list of qualifications, and if you comply with ACAP certification through Seaport, boom, you've already knocked out 90% of that list. The few things that might be a little bit variant would be matter of what's the level of insurance that you have. Seaport requires, I forget what ours is, $1 million or $2 million. It's $2 million, I think it is, and Boat US is pretty much the same. A lot of us have 3 million. So little things like that, we may want to go above and beyond it. We may not, but I think the ACAP, you're right. The ACAP certification from Seaport is a great baseline to say, we know these companies are. To give you this is kind of an interesting story, and I won't take too long to do it, but the state of Florida, well, actually, the federal government, Jones Act, they rewrote the wording in the Jones Act, which is a maritime document or maritime federal law. And in it, they just decided to change the wording. They decided, oh, we're going to change this wording from salver to wrecker, and actually from wrecker to salver. And it created this huge change around the country. And we had to go to try to fix it, because it was one word. In Florida, a wrecker has to be certified by a district court judge to prove they are of sound mind and body, and they are not a shyster. or something along those terms. It was really archaic language. And it goes back to the pirates back in Florida in the 1800s. All of a sudden, every one of our companies was out of business because we had to put a $10,000, you had to pay $10,000 to go through the court process with a lawyer to get that. And we'd been doing it every day. And all of a sudden, one day, we can't do it anymore because we don't have this. And the insurance companies loved it. They just basically said, we're not paying you. So we fixed that. So we got to be careful on what we put together in terms of a standard and the language we use. But the ACAP and Seaport has already established all of those parameters, I think. So I think we're pretty good.
Well, that's a really good question. When we get down the road and we have model legislation that we hope will avoid all unintended consequences, are there agencies or groups, organizations that would have the legal staff to look at the model legislation and say, you know, like, let's avoid a certain word? Is that something that Boat US could help us with, or anybody else?
I'll let Alana speak to that. I would think, yes, definitely Seaport would look at it. Seaport is national and does look at some state level. And we do have, we have access to attorneys to check that out to see if it meets. I think we would vet through it, but whether we would actually run it up, how far up the flagpole and how deep would get involved. But Seaport would definitely be involved in and like to be involved in seeing this. The fact that I'm here, you've already got Seaport engaged in it is effectively what it amounts to.
We so appreciate that you're here. Definitely.
Terry wears 6 hats. I definitely think that we can run it by Boat US's government affairs people. They do work on the state and federal, usually in relation to recreational, and they leave more of the commercial stuff to Seaport because we don't like to step on Seaport toes. They know towing and salvage, but I know, Terry, that Seaport works with David and John pretty regularly on things that do overlap. So I don't see why we couldn't have that conversation with them.
Yeah, no, it's not. I don't think there's any, we're there. And I think it's just a matter of looking through it and we'll bring whatever we can to the table on both angles of that to work with it. It's like I said, it's unintended consequences are my favorite thing. I think I've run, that's what I spent most of my time in this national or federal. Anytime the Coast Guard decides we're going to say towers must, a towboat must, all of a sudden, all of our boats get involved in it. And it might not even comply because we are 25-foot recreational almost style boats. And they're talking about tugboats. So yes, you've got some oversight coming on.
That is fabulous. That's a fabulous resource. Yeah, one thing we learned from talking with California, when they crafted their bill, their definitions were not precise enough. And they kept using the word marine debris. This was about removing marine debris. And in their minds, they were thinking nothing but vessels. But then people said, well, here's a car that drove off a pier, spend your money and get it out, and lots of other things like that. So they cautioned that we be very careful with the legislation that results from this effort. I'm reminded of something else, and there's another marine debris issue I'm working on. And we spoke to a local government about their successful implementation of a program, and they interviewed the populations that were affected by their program and found out that the number one thing that made their program successful is there was one person to call, and she always answered the phone. So people didn't get into, a big mess of who to call. We don't know. So I'm wondering if we could turn to the budget at this point that Jeff and I have mocked up for your reaction, because it does include a suggestion that there be one person in the state of Virginia who is, managing this program. But are there any other comments anybody wants to make about this certification issue?
My comment wasn't on the certification issue. I just wanted to double check. I know you said you talked to Rhode Island about their ADV program. Did you also talk to Marine Trade and Evan about fiberglass recycling for disposal?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would highly nationally, where we are with the conversations, the big things that we're trying to connect is voluntary turn-in programs and efficient, sustainable disposal. Those are where I can give you people to lift up boats all day long. Gary, Terry, I got hundreds of them. I can't give you an inventory, a single contact person, and preventing them from getting in the water and what to do with them after you get them out. Those are where the national conversations are going. That's what we're talking with NOAA about, the Sport Fish Council across the board. So really looking at voluntary turn-in programs and that disposal are going to be huge things after you line up who's removing it and how they're removing it, and everybody working together to remove it one time instead of 2 times or 3 times or things like that.
Well, that's great input. Thank you. And if Virginia does decide to go for a NOAA removal grant, which will be announced this summer, we'll definitely have a conversation with you about that, because there seems to be great interest in going after a NOAA grant. But exactly what would we do with it? Would we try to learn more about the Rhode Island model of recycling? I put that in quotes because recycling fiberglass hulls and their program is more about using them as an energy source mostly. Or would we pursue something else? So yeah, we'd love to explore that question with you soon, probably. Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen and show this budget mock-up that we've got for your reaction. So what we've been towards in multiple conversations is a fee, an annual fee on recreational boaters that would fund an ADV program. We've heard from people that this seems more feasible than trying to get state funding directly from the General Assembly. And we've heard from many that it seems to be fair that the people who would benefit from this program also support this program. We learned from the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources that there are between 230 and 240,000 registered vehicle vessels. So for our mock-up, we did 235,000, as you see here. And then we guesstimated what could be an annual fee to charge. And we just randomly picked $2 a year, $4 a year, and $6 a year to see what kind of revenue that would generate. And you see that if we had $4 a year per vessel, that would generate almost $1 million. So anyone who was renewing their boat for 3 years would pay $12 extra. Which, as somebody pointed out, that's the cost of a good 6-pack of beer. So not too much. And yet it would generate a substantial amount of funding. So I'll pause there and see, are there any thoughts about any concerns, other than the fact we know that any language we use has to be in compliance with the Coast Guard's annual recreational safety grant to states. And later, probably next week or the week after that, Jeff Flood and I will be speaking with NOAA Marine Debris Program people, because we're thinking that as we spoke to all these different states, this has come up several times, this acknowledgement that the NOAA annual grants to states does have a requirement that states don't add to the registration fee. But can, at the same time the registration fee is being collected, there be an auxiliary fee? And if so, what can that be called, just so everyone's happy? And we're thinking that rather than the state of Virginia having that conversation with the Coast Guard, it would be better coming from a national entity, NOAA, just to clarify the language. And a number of states, I think, need that clarification. So I'll pause there and see if there's anyone that has a comment about an annual fee in Virginia to support this program. Thumbs up, thumbs down, Not sure. Thumbs up. Okay.
Alana, you weren't there, but yes, when they had the federal use tax on boats. Do you remember that?
I do.
Tax with the sticker?
Yeah, so I'm wearing the nonprofit hat right now. And I don't, on the nonprofit side, I don't get to say too much about any of that stuff. So I actually was just writing up something to David Kennedy, who Chris Edmondson heads up our government affairs office. David works for him, to just kind of put it on his radar, the thought, and see what they have as far as research in the past and conversations and anything regarding that. But it's a tough one. Like, fees are always a tough one in any conversation that happens, because the biggest thing is, the biggest example I can give is the Sport Fish Fund, which is funded mostly by boaters, because it's the fuel and things like that, the taxes on boats, and it mostly goes to fishing, which is still important, and but it's making sure that balance of any fees are for sure going where it says it's going and where it needs to go. And typically my experience in conversations is boaters are willing to pay fees that impact boating, right, but if they can't clearly see the connection between them and boating, it's a little bit of a struggle. So I wanted to just float this by David. He has a better understanding. I don't deal with legislation. I don't deal with lobbying. So I don't always have the best grasp of it unless he tells me what I'm supposed to know. So I want to give him the details and see if he has some thoughts.
That was kind of why yesterday or the other day I mentioned maybe we title it something that careful titling is what we're going to have to do to this. And I agree. I think it was Neil maybe had said we didn't want to call it a waterway fund, and I don't disagree. I think he's right to some degree. But when you say abandoned and derelict vessel, first thing I think people are going to think is, okay, this is a good thing to do. Then they're going to go, why doesn't the owner of that boat take care of that problem? It's not my problem. So if we don't just keep that in mind as we craft the name or the whatever this is going to be called. I don't think $4 out of somebody's pocket when they're registering their boat is a big deal. When I look at it and I see $7 for this in the state of Virginia for the registration fee, $10 for the actual titling fee or whatever, it's nothing. I look at the tax at 2% or $2,000 and I go, oh God, I got to pay $300 for this boat. So that's all they're bothered by. $4 in the line of doing this is not a problem. Where we put it and how we collect it, I get it. That's an issue. Can't be on the registration form, I guess. Maybe it's a separate form, and maybe in that we can actually define a little bit more of what this goes to and the benefits of it and so on and so forth. But the way you put it across, that luxury tax, the federal use tax, it was actually I think they called it the luxury tax, because RVs and boats had to pay it, and you got a sticker to put on your boat. So I don't even know if there's a sticker necessary. Honestly, they just have to pay us. We need to put the money in a pool somewhere in a bank account and not let it go to anything other than boating related business, derelict vessels and abandoned vessels first, and then whatever else we can carve up, make it look pretty. That's my political side of it is try to dress up the pig.
Okay. Well,
I'm with Terry on the careful how you say it, how it's addressed, because the people who are registering the boats are usually not the people who are abandoning the boats. They're not paying into it. So it is boaters paying into it to make boating better, but the boaters who are paying into it are not the ones that are abandoning the vessels. So that is something to be careful of. And I can get some additional feedback from David on past things, other states, feelings by boaters. I'm sure another state has done this, and we've sent out some kind of alert that we got comments back. So he might be able to give some feedback on that.
We'd appreciate that. That'd be great. And we also, as I think you're all alluding to, we don't want to name the program in a way that builds unreasonable expectations. Like we don't want people to say, hey, I paid $4 a year, so now at the end of my boat's life, I want you to spend $10,000 to remove it. You know, it's still the boater's responsibility. So yeah, it's all great points. Any other?
Alana hit on this is a perspective I want to put in people's head while it's fresh in my mind. We've sort of broached this in some conversation, but you're absolutely right. So the person who's registering that boat at that time, at that moment, they have high hopes and it's their dream. It's a great thing. That boat's not going to the dump. They sell it to somebody else or they give it to somebody else and they don't find it as easy to manage the dream. They don't register the boat. And now that boat is the one we're trying to get rid of. So if you were to put the burden on the backs of the people that are really causing the problem, it's about law enforcement and it's about making the person who sells the boat, gives the boat away. It's so they need to almost drive to Richmond and prove that they gave the boat to so-and-so so that now everybody knows who so-and-so is and has control of that boat. I don't think it's not an easy task, but if we can figure out that other piece we talked about, how to make it extremely beneficial to the person selling or giving that boat away to notify the state of who now has responsibility for it. It's broad, but that's the difference here. That's where the boat goes south, is with somebody who doesn't want to register it and doesn't want to fix it up and they want to get rid of it and they didn't pay into this fund.
That is definitely one of the issues we found in multiple states, is the registration being the requirement of the new owner falls back on somebody. We had somebody in Maryland that donated their boat to a boat donation auction for nonprofit that's here locally, that donated the boat, and the new owner of the boat did not register it, and the nonprofit doesn't register it in their name, and then the boat was abandoned. And so he did the responsible thing. He donated his boat to a nonprofit to help them. And when it falls back on previous owners, that's where a lot of frustration comes in for them.
Katie, I have
Okay.
one question.
Mhm.
Is Tom on this call? I didn't see him at the bottom. Tom, yes.
No, he
We
did
need-
send us an email last week saying he's basically doing 2 jobs right now, and I wasn't able to join us.
And I don't know, that maybe you or Jeff one could look into it. Did he not say in one of our group meetings that Virginia has closed up the temporary registration loophole, where you could go to anybody that sells a fishing license and get a temporary 30-day boat registration?
Yeah, it's
Not familiar to me.
Yeah, there's a blue form and you can get it from, I think you're supposed to be able to get it from boat dealers. Yeah, we had the police actually stop a boat that had applied for registration and everything in that blue temporary form. I think what you can do through the state. Used to be able to go to Walmart or something like that. But yeah, it exists. It's there, but not many people using it.
Well, no, Terry, what we had the problem down in Lake Anna. These people were buying boats off of Facebook and Craigslist and coming down and taking the VA numbers in and temporarily registering the boat, VA numbers to the boat, to their driver's license information. And they were never following through with the title because it's an open-ended loop. You can do that as many times. There's no tracking or anything of that nature. And that's kind of what we've run into on this 96 Sea Ray that ended up in one of their lakes abandoned last week. And that's the whole problem. The original titled owner sold it over 10 years ago, but they have over 20 applications for temporary registrations that aren't processed until it's titled. And I know that the loophole was supposed to be closed when the new company that processes boat registrations, Virginia for Virginia took over out of Texas. But I saw one last week on the lake because he had his little blue piece of paper laid up in the dash of the boat.
Okay.
So
I don't know.
that's something else too, because those are the ones that are abandoning their boats out here, not the hard title holders.
All right. So these temporary registrations of boats are not hard titles. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
I don't recall Tom talking about this. Do you, Jeff?
Nope.
Or Mitchell?
Nope. I think he was just saying that in the last meeting that both you and Gary and Tom were at, that there was some issue with the paperwork or some roadblock, and he said he was going to work with you, but that was separate from the temporary registration.
I
Yeah,
think
that
this is one of the first meetings we had that we were discussing this.
Okay. We'll go back and take a look at our notes and our recordings. All right, so we've got half an hour left of our meeting. Let me run through this proposed budget and get your feedback. What we did is we assumed a $4 a year fee just for the sake of doing the budget once. So again, that would raise about $940,000 a year. And as you see here, we've got some proposed expenses. First would be a salaried person, a full-time employee whose job would be to run all aspects of this program. And we also put in some money for a budget for education and outreach, for example, going to boating shows or places where boaters gather. This would include some travel, registration fees, things like that. We also had $90,000 for an at-risk program, thinking again of the Florida model where local law enforcement could identify boats that were showing the signs of being at risk, not having lights and things like that, and encourage the people to do the right thing. I also, on this line, I said an at-risk program, ID at-risk vessels, and possibly a turn-in program. The states that have turn-in programs, pretty much from what we heard, none of them started with that year one because it's expensive, even though it saves a ton of money. So that may not be a year one project for this new employee to start that. We also noticed that many times when funds are managed by a state agency, the state agency takes a chunk for the fiscal management and the overhead that they put into managing a program. So we just gave a stab at 5% of the funds would stay with DWR for administrative expenses. But the bulk of the money, as you see there, is on the next line, the removal and disposal, which could be, we put down reimbursements to local governments or block grants to PDC, or it could be that from today's conversation, it sounds like that might be directly working with contractors, with towers. So if we did have in year one, $695,000 for removal, that would be 45 vessels removed if the average cost is $15,000. So that's a broad range. We know that some boats cost $3,000 to $4,000 to remove and others $40,000. We did hear from Terry that that's not an unreasonable average cost. We'd love everyone else's input too. So that's how we proposed, and we'd love your feedback now on what you think about this possibility.
I had a question. Do you think, based on the conversations, that it would be a full-time position?
Yes.
Okay.
That was our expectation talking to other states.
Okay.
And when we say manager, I mean, that's manager in the sense of if we have an official ADV program, if it doesn't get to that, but we have a fund, we've actually seen some other states on NOAA's sort of portal that compares all these states. And, you know, some of them have legislation, have funding, but no programs. Some of them have a program, but no funding. We don't know all the details on how that's structured, but basically this person, based on the salary you put there, would be kind of a mid-level, you know, an environmental scientist at DEQ type of thing, or a, you know, regional person and staff at DWR, or I think I call them environmental engineers at VMRC, something like that. So we're not talking an overall division manager. We're not talking someone who's, you know, 20 years experience. This is, you know, pretty overlap in admin and finance ability, plus obviously the environmental knowledge and understanding of this problem type of thing. But wearing many hats, but not a senior person, I don't think. Is that your understanding, Katie?
Yep, that's exactly right. And some of the thoughts of what this person would do, sorry, this is so tiny, let me make it bigger. So we're thinking that this person would maintain an inventory, process reimbursements if that's the way we go, or certainly process payment to contractors, do the budget management, assist people, either local governments or others, to find the last known owners, work on education, see if we can't get ADV education into some existing either boats safety courses or other ways to educate boaters. And something else that we heard from, I think this was South Carolina, is decisions on how to spend their ADV funds come from a council that's made up of a diverse group of people, some law enforcement, some state agency people, some marina people, because there's a lot of nuance, and sometimes they'd be asked a question that some people would say, yeah, that fits this program, and others would say, no, that's just, you know, a little bit too far off. So if we end up having such a advisory council, this person would oversee that. And the first year would be setting up all of these things and processes and contracts and all, answering questions. Like one question that we heard, some states will not touch an ADV that's on private property or at a private marina. They only deal with ADVs on public land or on public shorelines, public waterways. But does that create a perverse incentive for marinas to have an ADV float away and, you know, float away from their private marina? So that's a question that needs to be answered. And if the fund grows, could we look at a voluntary turn-in program? But that would not probably be year one. And just going back to some notes that came up yesterday, and I know this is more than we can all look at right now. These are some of the comments that came up yesterday when we looked at the budget. Like, do we want to have a decal or sticker program? Does that make sense? Be careful about how we name the program, which we talked about today. The need for political allies to pass any legislation. The need to provide specific language for bills. And there was one thing I particularly wanted to say here. Oh, yes, if the fund grew, like maybe years 1 and 2 and 3, there's enough legacy, older ADVs that have been out there for years that need to be removed. But maybe year 3 or 4, there could be the possibility of a surplus, the need to keep that in the boat safety world, not have it siphoned off into some other fund. And we did hear from other states that, you know, you might have a surplus this year, but one hurricane can change that. One hurricane can create such a demand that you need all the funds you've got. Okay, I'll be quiet and listen again as to any comments or thoughts you have on this.
I do have a question that harks back to something you said about California was telling you to be careful about how you refer to it, marine debris, large scale marine debris, an abandoned derelict vessel. Is there a reason you wouldn't want to remove things other than, so Gary can probably attest to this more, but we have towers that have reached out to us about things other than boats. One lake has a plane that crashed into the lake, somewhat on the shore or not. And could they use NOAA money to remove the plane or the car that you talked about? Is there a reason to not remove things other than, especially if there's a surplus of money, to remove other large scale marine debris?
Yeah, I think I'll speak to that first. I think, yes, of course, there's a desire to get all marine debris from the tiniest to the largest out. I guess we're focusing on ADV because that is our work group mission, but I think that's a really, really good question. And maybe if we did have this advisory council in the future, they could address those questions. But there's also the question of where's the funding coming from? You know, if this program is funded only by recreational boaters, what would the perception be if the money started to be spent on other large marine debris items? Is that a separate need, or is that something that could be incorporated into this? Good. I mean, it's a great question.
Yeah,
Other thoughts?
The comment that came up along this line was really more aligned with the term. If we say it's a marine debris or a, I think I used the word waterway hazards or waterway fund. That's a little bit too broad, because now you can use it for dredging, you can use it for buoys and things like that. But for the debris, I would think that fits right in line with this. That's sort of the reason for saying, let's be able to use that additional money, the reserve or the surplus money, so to speak. But the definition of what we have to define it, and we have to probably make it no more than a certain percentage of the surplus, because you don't want to, we're going to be building that surplus, and theoretically it's going to grow and it's going to keep growing as opposed to going back and forth. But in a hurricane, you're going to need more than you do on an average day after a couple of years. But maybe it's a percentage, and that's what I think the council is a very important piece of this. When you get into that, if it's just boats, that's maybe a little bit easier to manage. One person can make that judgment because it's the defined black and white line. But when you say ADVs and then other marine debris as determined, that's where somebody's got to then come back in and decide what it's going to be and why we should allocate how much and that kind of thing.
I guess you could argue too, it is a safety hazard to recreational boaters in some of this. So yeah, great, good points.
Yeah,
I think that,
good.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was gonna say real quick that yeah, Katie just took the words out of my mouth about making the case for boaters. It's like, well, I'm not the one that is abandoning it, just as Terry said earlier, but it's really ensuring the safety of the waterway for all. So that argument would also lead to any sort of navigational hazard. So you could kind of build it that way. And people would be like, well, I'm never going to abandon my boat. I'm, great. But what about that sunken plane, I guess, or car?
It'd be navigation as well as pollution. I mean, what comes to my mind is the worst place in the world for it probably is California. You've got all the marine debris offshore coming in. It's nets, it's plastic, it's whatever. That is a problem too, and it is a hazard to a boater because so is a log. There's logs floating down the river. Is that marine debris? It's a hazardous object. So that's where that council is going to have to come in to define what justifies and doesn't at this moment in time under this scope of things.
I agree with Terry. I think a council is probably going to be huge for you, especially if you're going to look at, besides the state funds, but also reaching out to NOAA for funds, because NOAA's funds only, one of the struggles we're having is NOAA funds will cover coastal. but not lakes. If you can't connect that water body to a coastal environment, NOAA funds won't go to it. And we are having so many of our inland towers reaching out to us about planes and cars and houseboats on lakes, and there's no federal funding for that because it's all under EPA's jurisdiction and they don't have funding for it and they won't provide grants to remove those. So having a council that says, go after this boat with NOAA money on this coastal area, Terry's area, that NOAA can cover that. But Gary's area is really, there's no other funding for that. And it would be beneficial to have a council be able to say inland versus coastal and also help with those grant applications if eligible to cover all of the inventory.
Great point.
Real quick, folks, while Kay's kind of scrolling down, on the very topic of the council, I've brought up Rhode Island's, their website, about their kind of council composition. I mentioned it briefly earlier in the interview summary, but Kurt Blanchard was the gentleman that we interviewed, and he is the chair, and he's the Department of Environmental Management's, his director's representative. So I think he's the deputy director of law enforcement. So he is uniform law enforcement, but he's also with the state environmental group. And then they had, I believe the CRMC is Marine Resources. So they have those folks. They have Marine Trades on there. They have the Harbor Masters Association. They have Save the Narragansett Bay, and NGO. They have the Environmental Management Legal Counsel, and then they just have administrative to the commission. So that just gives you that overview of what, the commission that I referenced earlier, their membership.
That was Rhode Island.
Start thinking about, where, yes, that is Rhode Island. So it'd be cool to have, someone like a Terry or a Gary and Alana, and then have, federal, state, local, or regional governments, and then maybe an NGO like Lynnhaven River Now showed up to a couple meetings. Something like that. Just food for thought.
Hi, Chris.
Something just popped into my head as along similar lines. Well, first off, on the council, when you started naming all that off, I went, oh my God, that's a huge, broad spectrum. I don't know if we want some of those people in there. This is going to quagmire the whole process. So keep that in mind. I don't like quagmires.
Noted.
The other is, well, two things. One, by incorporating the marine debris, we can possibly craft the name as we were talking about. It's something that's a little broader. Number two is anybody can pay into this. It doesn't have to be just boaters. So maybe we look at another piece of this, not to focus heavy on it right now, but when we see it come up, let's incorporate the possibility that when you buy a kayak, you can pay into the fund. That's going to be plastic marine debris one day. Where do you stop in terms of who can support this? If we were to have a program on the counters of all the recreational places, you can donate this. I don't know how people donate much anymore, but donation or some other additional pieces to it could help increase the fund and broaden the spectrum a little bit. And there was one other thing, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, that's a great thing, though. So, yes, you're right. If we open it up to anyone who can fund it, I mean, it's like current Virginia Wildlife Resources takes money from anybody, bird watchers, not just bird hunters. So, yeah.
And I'll add that Ohio, in our interview with that gentleman, they require non-motorized watercraft under a certain length, and like kayaks and canoes and paddle boards, I believe. They don't have to have a title, but they have to be registered, and I think they pay a fee. So that's the sort of normal boats and watercraft, so what we're thinking of here is registration and title, just like everyone else. And then this other subcategory is just the registration, which I think they pay the fee, and that allows them to track some of these things, but they don't have to do the transfer of title for a kayak. So that was just an interesting tidbit about those additional things to Terry's point about adding on. I think they get revenue from that, maybe a lesser amount.
Okay, with 10 minutes left, Jeff, is there anything else on our agenda we haven't touched on yet?
I can share it real quick again. I think it was just next steps for us. Oh, no. So real quick, apologies. Everyone seen that now?
Mhm.
Jenna, okay. So where we had left it with Megan leading the charge, up until the couple weeks ago, and she'll be back with us too after deployment ends. But we were thinking about like a list of landfill requirements, and she, as DEQ, was going to be looking at works with folks with solid waste and DEQ and looking through the permitting and just getting a list by region using the DEQ, just normal regional officer jurisdictions as a guide. And then Terry, I think you were going to look at marinas and just kind of work to compile a list. And it's, we got some time for sure to do this, but I think that was the dual kind of task that this subcommittee was working on. So I just didn't know if you had any updates or questions, comments, or if we want to change that sort of scope of research and what we could kind of work to get done by June, because we're taking a break for a month. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, I already have a list. I've got to do a graphic of it. It's not my bailiwick, and I've got one girl here I can hopefully use her shortly to do it. But one of the things was to determine who the contractors could be in the different regions, and I've already identified those, called most of them, and they're all of our Towboat US folks are on board with it. Look at it, and are ready to be participants and play in the game or whatever. They'll even get on the calls. But at this point, I think it's just the buy-in is there. And I can identify the regions, who can cover them, and then everything else will flow beyond that. And I put together some of those standards based off the ACAP and everything. So that I have the basis going right now. By the time we meet next time, I'll have a lot of information for you and graphics and so forth. While I got 1 second here, the other thing the other question or other point that I had. So we're going to hire a manager to deal with this. Their job can also be to research and you got to keep this up to date. So we're always looking for the recycle, and we're always going to be looking for landfills that take it or don't take it, and how that'll be a dynamic environment. Part of that manager's job is to determine, identify, and seek out ways to cut the cost, which would be the recycle part of it, or even recycling may be more expensive, but it's better than putting it in a landfill. So managing that piece, doing research on it, and so forth. And some of the funds probably need to set aside for that research, for trying to find those better ways. If we had $100,000 extra one year, why not try to fund a study group to figure something out better? These kinds of things can be useful down the road as far as keeping that person busy. Number one, as a business person, I like to figure out how do I keep my employees moving, and then number two, spend the money wisely, right?
Yeah, awesome.
Fabulous.
Hey, Terry, if you need some help with those graphics or anything, feel free to shoot anything over to me, and may not be me, but I can get somebody here who's better at it to make something pretty.
No problem. I'd love to drop by, but they don't let me in the building anymore.
They don't let me in the building either. So
Awesome. Great. This is awesome. Keep everything moving along, and I'm sure Megan will appreciate that, everyone's efforts when we reconvene. Speaking of that next meeting, I'm thinking they would be probably mid-June, as we tend to have the policy subcommittee meet first in any given month, followed by funding. And then this one is right after the funding. That was yesterday, but that probably buys us some time. Everyone kind of comes back from Memorial Day weekend and that sort of thing. So we might do policy and funding first week of June, and then the next week do the removal subcommittee. And I think Megan will be back by that point. So that's sort of just keep an eye out for a doodle poll with that. And then as I mentioned earlier, we're going to interview Maryland and Washington State to get some more info. Maryland probably being the most important. And then we might, reach out to Texas, just because that's got a large shoreline and obviously a busy port with Houston and Galveston. And as you all know, we're
we're going to have a white paper update from William and Mary at the May 20 overall work group meeting. We've settled that date. We're going to be meeting with them tomorrow to kind of, we've had updates throughout subcommittee meetings, but we want to just kind of hash some things out with them, just with their team. We're going to try to reach out to interview some Smith Mountain Lake marinas and some in Hampton roads. That's been a lower priority than the other states, but we definitely want to get their input in this process. And then to Katie's point earlier about working with PDCs, I don't think it was necessarily a genius idea, but because I do work with these planning district commissions through my coast zone management program as grantees, it is a convenient vehicle with many friendly and familiar faces to be able to think about those block grants, even if, to Terry's point earlier and Gary about working with the state directly, if there was a I would say the PDCs are probably in a better position capacity wise versus the localities. So I'm agreeing with that point, and I'm also suggesting a potential other option just to consider it. And then really just a side task. I mean, I'm just going to look at some of the commercial vessel registration and fees and that sort of thing, and BMRC's side of it, captain's licenses and that sort of thing. So that's really our next steps. Just, doodle poll was for mid-June, and then circle your calendars for May 20th for the overall ADV work group meeting. So that's all I got. Anything else, Katie? I think we had Renee. Yep, Renee joined us. Hi, Renee.
We're actually just finishing up, Renee, but we did record this, and
I thought it didn't start till 11:30. I'm so sorry.
oh no, start at 10. Oh, so you thought you were early. I'm sorry. But we did record it, and we will have notes, and it's been a fabulous discussion. We thought this might be a short meeting, but it ended up being really, really fruitful, lots of great ideas. So I encourage you to watch the recording. I'll have it up probably by Friday. And we'd love to get your input on some of the great thoughts that we've come up with here.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that.
Yep. Thanks so much. Yep. I think these meetings are getting better and better. Really happy to say that. And everyone we've always had good ones, but really the input and everyone's candor and also just, looking ahead and avoiding some of these pitfalls has been really, really valuable. So thank you all again.
Yeah, it's been excellent. So by June, we'll have the white paper in hand. We'll have a summary of where we are. And I think June, July, August will be really critical for us to take the next step, is to translate our ideas into possible legislation, possible policy changes. So thank you for all the work you're doing in between our meetings too. Well, if any other closing thoughts before we say goodbye until June. And thank you, Gary, I got your email that you sent me with the BOA information. So I'll share that with everybody. Thank you.
Everybody get out there and go boating.
I wish. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.